That is, they'd go to someone, they say, are you a loyal, patriotic Soviet citizen? The person would say, yes. And then they would say, well, we need you. The fatherland needs you. And they say, well, what do you want from me? And they say, well, we want you to tell us about your best friend. We think he should not really be your best friend, etc. And so a lot of people who had ended up being sources for the KGB were now in a panic in Minsk because they felt they'd be exposed with the Oswald file. And that was a real concern for the KGB officers in Minsk because, after all, they're supposed to protect their people. And so these arguments went on about how much we would get. And in the middle of all this, while sometimes we're getting something and sometimes we're not, and we're beginning to see that what we're finally going to get is all the stuff on Oswald and his wife Marina, but nothing on the sources around Lee Harvey Oswald. As one KGB officer said to us, he said, you know, even if you don't get these sources, you're going to be able to guess who they are. And that was true. You could guess. It wasn't too hard to tell. It was just very hard to print it. You know, unless you wanted to spend the rest of your life in law court. Well, what developed out of that is, since we were stymied, is we started interviewing all the people who had known Oswald on our own. And that turned out very well, because they had been told not to talk about the assassination after it occurred. The Russians were so convinced that Oswald hadn't done it that they felt that it was probably an American provocation. They were using him as a patsy. His word was their word. And that America wanted to start the Third World War. So they went around to everyone who'd known him in Moscow and in Minsk, and they said, don't talk about him, don't talk about it. And very few of those people talked to anyone about it for the next 30 years. So when we came along to interview them, it was like walking into a time capsule. Their memories were excellent. It was exactly the opposite of the situation here, where everybody had talked about it so much that it was as if you were walking on a field over which 500 tanks had gone back and forth, and in fact no one could remember what the truth was anymore because they talked to so many reporters that they lost the truth somewhere, as you do when you start telling a story and it gets better and better. So there it was, we worked with it. Now, the KGB material still had a certain virtue for us, which was that it gave a wonderful insight into the marriage of Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Prusakova. They got married very quickly, each for their separate reasons. Marina wanted to get married very much. She'd had a tough life in Leningrad, and since the Soviet Union is the most sexually conservative country I've ever visited, it would have been a perfectly wonderful country for American conservatives if you just could have given them a pill and put Russian in their brains, so they could have spoken the language, because they were absolutely happy over there. They were very happy. First of all, nobody had too much money, so they could all act like good Christians. That was one aspect of it. Another is you could walk the streets at night. And the third was that bad people were sent away. The fourth was that your daughters were safe, you see, and they weren't subject to sexual temptation. Now, Marina had an inquiring spirit in that direction. She was something like an American teenager in Leningrad. She had what she considered a very wild period. When we finally talked to her and interviewed her, we realized that her wild period would have been small potatoes for any American girl. But she was suffused with guilt over that wild period. And when she got to Minsk, everyone gossiped about her. And so she felt she had to get married. And here was this American, which gave her a particularly special purchase on the envy of her friends, because everybody was interested in this American. He was like a movie star in Minsk. He was a disappointing movie star because he wasn't a good worker, you know, and the Russians were very puritanical about that. If you weren't a good worker, you weren't a good person. So there was mixed feelings about Oswald. Some people thought he was worthless and a spoiled movie star, and others thought, he's a movie star, I want to meet him. So he had this odd life. He had a happy life for a little while until the weather got him. They got married in a hurry. And then they discovered that they were only semi-compatible. Now that's the saddest hyphenation in human experience when you apply to marriage. And in fact, they couldn't pass a bowl of soup back and forth. Now for that, we owe a great debt to the KGB. because without them, one would have been guessing. But what the KGB did is they recorded them all the time. They bugged the little apartment in which Oswald lived. And by the way, for those of you who heard it was a mansion he was living in, it's not true. He was living in a very small apartment, which I saw. And they got the apartment next door when the people who lived next to Oswald and Marina went away on a vacation for 3 weeks, possibly encouraged by the KGB. And they moved in and they drilled a little hole in the wall about the size of a pinhole, through which they put a fiber optic and attached a lens to it. They're very proud of this. The KGB, one of the secrets they were concealing as the evil empire is that they were terribly backward in their technology compared to us. So this was their great weapon. They were delighted with this fiber optic with a lens because they could see what people were doing in the next room, and the people wouldn't know that they were being spied on, presumably. And they also bugged the apartment. And these transcripts came down to us. I'm going to read you from one of them, a bit of it. They're repetitive, but then when is dialogue in marriage not repetitive? And this dialogue takes place about 3 weeks after they're married. Yes. I will say that for those of you who are enough like me to be hoping that they'll be making love and the dialogue will be recorded, I can only tell you that you're going to be disappointed, just as I was. In fact, we asked the KGB, we said, why is it that whenever it gets to be about 11 o'clock, your transcriber writes, tender, intimate moments, they speak softly, they go to bed. And so we had developed an odd relation with the man who was called the developer. That is the officer who was in charge of all the sources of information that were coming in. It was his job to make a synthesis of the case and decide what the reality was to report upstairs. So he said, well, we weren't interested. Now, the great thing about the KGB is that they do place a high value on intelligence. It's possible they place a higher value on it than our own intelligence people, because, and if you want proof, the odds are if you take the average CIA man, what he's good at is tennis. And the KGB, they pride themselves on their chess. In fact, if you ask a KGB man, do you play chess, he always looks at you and says, of course. And they have all their level. So, they respond well when you ask them a good question. They hate fishing expeditions, as we discovered. You couldn't just say to them, why didn't you debrief Oswald when he came to the Soviet Union? You had to get into it with them. You had to ask question after question. If the questions got good enough, they'd answer you. If someone wants to ask me a question later about that, I'll reply at length. Right now, it breaks the narrative flow of this particular offering. We're down to the sexual moments between Oswald and Marina and why they didn't record them. So we'd say, well, didn't you consider it important? Which was a good enough question to reply to. And he explained, this man we call Stepan in the book because he didn't want his real name given. Stepan said, well, you know, if we have a serious spy and he's using the woman to obtain information, then we would record every word while they were making love. And, you know, since his wife was the niece of a colonel in the NVD, which parenthetically is like the FBI, very roughly, to the CIA. NVD to KGB is like FBI to CIA. Since his wife was the niece of a colonel in the NVD, we were interested for a time in whether he would use such moments to explore what she knew about the NVD and her uncle. But he didn't. Well, that meant that they had recorded the early sexual conversations and we weren't seeing them.